Frank Romano's phone rang at midnight and pulled. A stranger's voice crackled through static, demanding help on a highway where the desert swallowed sound. 20 years ago, Frank had dragged a burning man from a vehicle and left him breathing in the sand. Now, under a sky empty of witnesses, he would meet that man again, older, richer, untouched by the dirt that clung to Frank's hands. The single-dad mechanic fixed a stranger's broken-down car, but the stranger owed him a life he had spent 2 decades forgetting. Recognition would arrive not as gratitude, but as a wound reopened. Subscribe now, because some debts are written in scars, and tonight the bill comes due. The phone rang at midnight, and Frank Romano woke to the sound of his own breath, shallow and uncertain. Tangled in the sheets of a bed too large for one person, the room was dark except for the blue glow of the screen, and for a moment he considered letting it ring, letting the world outside his small Arizona home remain distant and irrelevant. But the phone kept ringing, insistent, the way emergencies always were, and Frank knew that in a town this small, a midnight call meant someone needed him. He reached for the phone, his fingers stiff from years of gripping wrenches and steering wheels, and pressed it to his ear. The voice on the other end was sharp, clipped, impatient. The voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I need a mechanic," the man said without introduction, without apology. "I'm stranded on Route 9, about 20 miles west of town. The car won't start." Frank sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. He'd been awake until past 11, fixing the carburetor on Mrs. Henderson's station wagon, and before that he had spent the evening helping his daughter with her college applications, their kitchen table covered in forms and essays that felt like promises he couldn't keep. His daughter, Emma, was 18 now, bright and restless, eager to leave the desert and the silence of their life together, and Frank could not blame her. He had raised her alone since she was 4, since the day his wife left without explanation, without warning, and in the years since he had learned to live in the space between exhaustion and duty. "Where exactly are you?" Frank asked, swinging his legs out of bed, his bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. The man on the phone gave him directions, his tone sharp and precise, as if he were used to commanding rooms full of people, and Frank wrote them down on a scrap of paper he kept on his nightstand. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Frank said, and hung up before the man could respond. The drive out to Route 9 was long and empty, the kind of emptiness that defined Arizona nights, where the highway stretched flat and black under a sky so wide it felt like drowning. Frank's truck rattled as he drove, the engine coughing occasionally, a reminder that even machines grew old and tired. He kept the radio off, preferring the silence, the hum of tires on asphalt, the distant wail of wind through open desert. He thought about Emma, about the way she had looked at him earlier that evening, her eyes full of something he couldn't name, hope, maybe, or fear, or the quiet acknowledgement that she was leaving, and he would be alone. He had told her he was proud of her, that she deserved every opportunity the world could offer. But the words had felt hollow, inadequate, a poor substitute for the things he couldn't say. He loved her more than his own breath, more than the memory of the man he used to be, and the thought of her leaving felt like another kind of war, one he couldn't fight. When he reached the spot the man had described, Frank saw the car immediately, a sleek black sedan, pulled onto the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the darkness. The man stood beside it, arms crossed, his silhouette sharp against the faint glow of the headlights. He was tall, well-dressed even in distress, wearing a suit jacket that looked too expensive for a roadside breakdown. Frank pulled his truck up behind the sedan and climbed out, grabbing his toolbox from the bed. The air was cool, the kind of desert cold that arrived after sundown, and Frank could smell sage and dust and the faint metallic tang of engine oil. "Thanks for coming," the man said, though his tone suggested irritation more than gratitude. I've been stuck here for over an hour." Frank nodded, setting his toolbox down beside the sedan. "Let's take a look," he said simply, popping the hood. The engine was a mess of wires and metal, sleek and complicated in the way modern cars often were, but Frank had been fixing engines since he was 16, and his hands moved with practiced certainty. He checked the battery first, then the alternator, then the fuel lines, his flashlight cutting through the darkness in narrow beams. The man stood beside him, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his impatience palpable. "How long will this take?" the man asked, and Frank glanced at him briefly, noting the sharpness of his jaw, the way his hands were clasped behind his back, as if he were addressing a subordinate. "Depends," Frank said, returning his attention to the engine. "Could be 10 minutes, could be longer." The man sighed, a sound of exasperation, and Frank felt a flicker of something old and familiar, the quiet resentment of being treated as less than, as invisible, as a tool to be used and discarded. But he said nothing, because he had learned long ago that silence was easier than conflict. As Frank worked, he became aware of the man's voice, the way it carried a faint trace of something familiar, though he couldn't place it at first. The man was on his phone now, pacing beside the car, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. "I don't care what time it is," the man said, his voice rising slightly. "I need this resolved by morning." Frank listened without meaning to, his hands moving automatically, tightening bolts, reconnecting wires, and as he listened, a memory began to surface. Not a clear image, but a feeling, a sensation of heat and smoke and the sound of someone screaming. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the thought, and focused on the engine. The alternator belt was loose, he realized, nearly worn through, and he replaced it with a spare from his toolbox. When he turned the ignition, the engine roared to life, smooth and steady, and Frank closed the hood, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're all set," he said, stepping back. The man turned, phone still in hand, and for the first time he looked directly at Frank, his expression shifting from irritation to something else, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. The man stepped closer, lowering his phone, and in the faint light of the sedan's headlights, Frank saw his face clearly for the first time. He was older than Frank had initially thought, perhaps in his early 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back and a face that carried the weight of authority, of decisions made in boardrooms and conference halls. But it was the man's hand that caught Frank's attention, his right hand, which he extended now in a gesture of thanks. On the back of that hand, near the base of the thumb, was a scar, pale and jagged, shaped like a crescent moon. Frank stared at it for a moment longer than was polite, his mind racing, and the man noticed, pulling his hand back slightly. "Something wrong?" the man asked, his tone guarded. Frank shook his head, though his heart had begun to pound in a way it hadn't in years. "No," he said quietly. "Just thought I recognized that scar." The man's expression flickered, a shadow passing across his face, and he looked down at his hand, as if seeing the scar for the first time in a long while. Frank's mind was spinning now, pulling fragments of memory from the places he had buried them. The scar, the voice, the way the man held himself, all of it was familiar, unbearably so, and yet impossible. 20 years had passed since the war, since the desert of another country, since the night Frank had pulled a young soldier from a burning vehicle and dragged him into the sand. The soldier had been screaming, his uniform soaked in fuel, his hand burned and bleeding where he had tried to shield himself from the flames. Frank had wrapped the hand in gauze, his own hands shaking, and the soldier had looked up at him with eyes full of terror and gratitude. "You saved my life," the soldier had said, his voice breaking, and Frank had replied, "Just doing my job." That soldier had been 22 years old, fresh-faced and terrified, and Frank had been 42, a sergeant with 2 deployments behind him and a wife and daughter waiting at home. He had never learned the soldier's name, had never thought to ask, because in war, names didn't matter as much as survival. But now, standing in the desert night, Frank looked at the man before him and saw that soldier's face beneath the years, beneath the authority and polish. "You were there," Frank said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The man frowned, tilting his head slightly. "Where?" he asked, though his voice had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by something cautious, uncertain. Frank didn't answer immediately. He turned away, closing his toolbox, giving himself time to think, to breathe, to decide whether to say what he was thinking. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and Frank felt the weight of the years pressing down on him, the distance between who he had been and who he was now. "Doesn't matter," Frank said finally, lifting his toolbox and walking back toward his truck. The man followed him, his footsteps quick, insistent. "Wait," the man said. "What did you mean? Where was I?" Frank stopped, setting the toolbox in the bed of his truck, and turned to face the man. "You were in a war," Frank said quietly. 20 years ago, you were a lieutenant." The man's face went pale, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. He stared at Frank, his eyes searching, and Frank could see the moment recognition began to dawn, slow and inevitable. "You," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you pulled me out." Frank nodded, saying nothing, and the man took a step back, his hand rising to his chest as if to steady himself. I thought I'd never see you again," the man said, his voice trembling now, stripped of its earlier authority. "I looked for you after. I tried to find out who you were, but they said you'd been discharged, that you'd gone back to the States." Frank shrugged, the gesture almost dismissive. "I came home," he said. "Opened a shop, raised my daughter, that's all." The man shook his head, his eyes glistening now, and Frank could see the emotion building in him, raw and unfiltered. "You saved my life," the man said again. The same words he had spoken 20 years ago, and Frank felt something crack inside him, a wall he had built to keep the past at bay. The man introduced himself then, though Frank had already begun to suspect. "I'm Senator Thompson," the man said, his voice steadier now, though still thick with emotion. "I represent this state. I've been in office for 12 years. Frank nodded, unsurprised. He had recognized the name when the man first called, though he hadn't connected it to the soldier until now. Senator Thompson was well known, a rising figure in national politics, his face often on the news, his voice advocating for veterans' benefits and military reform. Frank had seen him on television once or twice, had even agreed with some of what he said, but he had never imagined that the polished senator was the same terrified lieutenant he had pulled from the flames. "I didn't know it was you," Thompson said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know." Frank looked at him, at the tears beginning to spill down the senator's face, and felt a strange mix of pity and discomfort. He didn't know what to do with the man's gratitude, with the weight of it, because for Frank that night had been one of many, a moment of duty in a war filled with moments like it. "You don't owe me anything," Frank said, his voice quiet but firm. "I did what anyone would have done." Thompson shook his head, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, the scarred hand, and Frank couldn't look away from it. "No," Thompson said. "No, you didn't. You risked your life. If you hadn't been there, I'd be dead." Frank didn't respond, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like false modesty or empty deflection. He had risked his life, yes, but he had also come home, had left the war behind, had tried to forget the things he had seen and done. Thompson, it seemed, had never forgotten. "Let me repay you," Thompson said, stepping closer, his voice urgent now. "Please, I have money, influence. I can help you. Your daughter. Anything you need." Frank felt a flicker of anger then, sharp and unexpected, because the offer felt like an insult, as if his life could be reduced to a transaction, as if gratitude could be measured in dollars and favors. "I don't need anything," Frank said, his voice harder now, and he climbed into his truck, starting the engine. Thompson stood there, looking lost, his hands hanging at his sides, and Frank felt a pang of guilt for the harshness in his tone. "Just doing my job?" Frank said again, the same words he had spoken 2 decades ago, and he pulled away, leaving the senator standing alone on the side of the highway, his silhouette growing smaller in the rearview mirror. The drive home was silent, but Frank's mind was loud, filled with the roar of flames and the sound of a young man's voice, grateful and terrified, echoing across the years. Frank didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the encounter over and over, each detail sharp and unrelenting. The scar on Thompson's hand, the way his voice had trembled when he said, "You saved my life," the tears that had spilled down his face like something breaking open, all of it pressed against Frank's chest, making it hard to breathe. He had spent 20 years trying to forget the war, trying to bury the memories beneath the rhythm of his work, the routine of raising Emma, the small, predictable life he had built in the desert. But now, those memories were surfacing, unbidden and relentless, and Frank couldn't push them back down. He thought about the night he had pulled Thompson from the vehicle, the heat so intense it had blistered the skin on his arms, the smell of burning fuel and flesh, the sound of the lieutenant's screams. Frank had acted on instinct, dragging the younger man away from the flames, covering him with his own body to shield him from the explosion that followed. He had stayed with Thompson until the medics arrived, holding his burned hand, whispering reassurances he didn't believe, and when it was over, Frank had walked away without looking back. In the weeks that followed that night, Frank had received no recognition, no commendation, nothing to mark what he had done. The war had moved on, as wars always did, consuming lives and leaving little room for gratitude. Frank hadn't minded, or so he had told himself. He hadn't saved Thompson for glory or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, because leaving someone to die was unthinkable. But now, lying in the darkness of his bedroom, Frank wondered if he had been lying to himself all these years. Maybe he had minded. Maybe he had wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged, not as a hero but simply as someone who mattered, someone whose actions carried weight. Instead, he had come home to a life that felt smaller and quieter with each passing year, a life where his heroism had no place, no currency. He had opened his auto shop, raised his daughter, and watched the world move on without him, and he had told himself it was enough. But tonight, seeing Thompson's face, hearing the gratitude in his voice, Frank realized it hadn't been enough. It had never been enough. At dawn, Frank rose and made coffee, the ritual grounding him, pulling him back into the present. Emma was still asleep, her door closed, and Frank moved quietly through the house, not wanting to wake her. The kitchen was small and cluttered, the counters covered with bills and mail, and the remnants of last night's dinner. Frank sat at the table, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, and stared out the window at the desert stretching endlessly beyond. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, Frank allowed himself to feel the beauty of it, the quiet solace of a new day. But the peace didn't last. His mind kept returning to Thompson, to the senator's offer to repay him, and Frank felt a flicker of something he didn't want to name. Resentment, maybe, or bitterness. He didn't want Thompson's money or influence. He didn't want to be treated like a charity case, like someone who needed saving. And yet part of him couldn't help but wonder what his life might have looked like if he had accepted help, if he had allowed himself to be seen, to be valued, in the way Thompson seemed desperate to value him now. Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes still half closed. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft, and Frank nodded, gesturing for her to join him. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him, studying his face with the kind of quiet intensity she had inherited from him. "You okay?" she asked, and Frank forced a smile, though he knew she could see through it. "Just a long night," he said. "Got called out to fix a car." Emma nodded, sipping her coffee, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Frank wanted to tell her about Thompson, about the war, about the strange, unsettling feeling of being remembered after so many years of being forgotten. But he didn't know how to put it into words, didn't know how to explain the weight pressing down on his chest. "You ever think about the past?" Frank asked finally, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Emma looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said. "Why?" Frank shook his head, waving the question away. "No reason," he said. "Just thinking." Emma didn't press, and Frank was grateful for her silence, for the way she let him keep his secrets. That afternoon, Frank drove to the shop, the familiar route soothing in its predictability. The shop was a small, run-down building on the edge of town, its sign faded and peeling, but it was his, and it had kept him afloat for nearly 2 decades. Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal, and the sound of tools clanging filled the space, a rhythm Frank found comforting. He had 2 employees, both younger men, who treated him with a mix of respect and indifference. And today, they were working on a rusted pickup truck that looked beyond saving. Frank joined them, rolling up his sleeves, losing himself in the work. His hands moved with practiced ease, tightening bolts, replacing hoses, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. For a few hours, he didn't think about Thompson, didn't think about the war, didn't think about the weight of being forgotten. He was just Frank Romano, mechanic, father, survivor, and that was enough. But when the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the shop floor, Frank's phone rang, and he saw Thompson's name on the screen. He stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to answer, and finally he did. "Frank," Thompson's voice came through, urgent and earnest. "I need to see you again, please. I can't stop thinking about last night." Frank sighed, leaning against the workbench, his free hand rubbing his temple. "Senator, I told you, you don't owe me anything," he said. "I did what I did, and it's over. Let it go." Thompson's voice cracked slightly, and Frank could hear the desperation in it. "I can't," Thompson said. "You don't understand. You saved my life, and I've spent 20 years trying to live up to that. I need to thank you properly. I need to do something." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion settle over him like a heavy blanket. "You want to thank me," he said quietly. "Then just be a good man, be the kind of person worth saving. That's all I need." There was a long silence on the other end, and then Thompson spoke again, his voice softer now. "Can we at least talk, just once?" Frank hesitated, and then, against his better judgment, he agreed. They met at a diner on the outskirts of town, a small, unassuming place where the coffee was strong and the booths were cracked vinyl. Frank arrived first, choosing a corner booth where he could see the door, and he ordered a cup of coffee, his hands wrapped around the mug as he waited. The diner was nearly empty, just a few locals scattered at the counter, and the air smelled of grease and bacon and the faint sweetness of maple syrup. Frank felt out of place, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the knowledge that Senator Thompson was coming, that the man who had once been a terrified lieutenant would walk through that door and sit across from him, bridging the gap between past and present in a way Frank wasn't sure he was ready for. When Thompson arrived, he looked different in the daylight, older somehow, his face lined with the marks of responsibility and exhaustion. He slid into the booth across from Frank, his movements careful, deliberate, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward, and Frank found himself wishing he hadn't agreed to this meeting. Thompson ordered coffee, his hands clasped on the table, and Frank noticed again the scar on his right hand, the pale crescent that marked him as the man Frank had saved. "Thank you for coming," Thompson said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Frank nodded, saying nothing, and Thompson continued. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about just being a good man. And I want you to know, I've tried. I've spent my entire career fighting for veterans, for people like you, because I never forgot what you did for me." Frank looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the sincerity in his eyes, the weight of guilt and gratitude that had shaped Thompson's life. "I'm not a veteran anymore," Frank said quietly. "I'm just a mechanic. I don't need saving, Senator." Thompson flinched at the words, and Frank felt a pang of regret, but he didn't take them back. They were true, and Frank had learned long ago that truth, however painful, was better than empty platitudes. Thompson leaned forward, his voice earnest now, almost pleading. "I'm not trying to save you, Frank. I'm trying to thank you. There's a difference." Frank shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You thanked me last night. That's enough." But Thompson wasn't giving up. "Let me help your daughter," he said, his tone shifting, becoming more practical. "You said she's applying to colleges. I have connections, influence. I can make sure she gets into the best schools, that she has every opportunity." Frank's hands tightened around his mug, and he felt a surge of anger, sharp and unexpected. "My daughter doesn't need your help," he said, his voice low and hard. "She's earned everything she's gotten, and she'll keep earning it. I don't want her life built on favors." Thompson's face fell, and for a moment he looked lost, as if Frank's rejection had stripped away the confidence he had built over the years. "I'm sorry," Thompson said quietly. "I didn't mean to offend you. I don't know how else to repay you." Frank sighed, his anger fading as quickly as it had come, replaced by a weary resignation. "You don't repay something like that," he said. "You just live with it." They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee, the noise of the diner filling the space between them. Frank found himself studying Thompson, trying to reconcile the man before him with the terrified lieutenant he had pulled from the flames. They were the same person, and yet they weren't. Thompson had built a life, a career, a legacy, while Frank had simply survived, and yet Frank didn't envy him. Thompson's success felt hollow, built on a foundation of guilt and gratitude that would never fully settle. "Do you ever think about that night?" Thompson asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Frank looked at him, surprised by the question, and then nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "but I try not to. It doesn't help." Thompson's eyes glistened, and Frank could see the emotion building in him again, raw and unguarded. "I think about it all the time," Thompson said. "I see it in my dreams. The fire, the heat, the way you dragged me out. I owe you everything, Frank. My life, my career, my family. None of it would exist without you." Frank didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and the silence stretched between them again, heavy and unbearable. After a while, Thompson reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, please call me." Frank looked at the card but didn't pick it up. "I won't," he said, his voice firm, and Thompson's face crumpled, the weight of rejection settling over him like a shroud. "Why?" Thompson asked, his voice breaking. "Why won't you let me help you?" Frank met his eyes, and for the first time he felt something like pity for the senator, for the burden he had carried all these years. "Because I don't need saving," Frank said quietly. "I never did. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something in return. And if you spend the rest of your life trying to repay me, you'll never be free of it." Thompson stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, and Frank could see the truth of his words sinking in, painful and undeniable. Frank stood, leaving money on the table for the coffee, and turned to go. But before he reached the door, Thompson called after him, his voice desperate. "Frank, wait!" Frank stopped, looking back, and Thompson rose from the booth, his face pale and stricken. "I just want to say thank you," Thompson said, his voice trembling. "One more time. Thank you." Frank nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and then he walked out into the sunlight, leaving Thompson standing alone in the diner, the weight of gratitude and guilt pressing down on him like an anchor he could never lift. The days that followed the meeting at the diner were strange and restless for Frank, as if the conversation with Thompson had dislodged something inside him that refused to settle back into place. He went through the motions of his life, opening the shop, fixing cars, making dinner for Emma, watching the desert sky turn from blue to orange to black, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in the space between the man he had been and the man he was now. He found himself thinking about the war more often, not in vivid flashbacks but in quiet, intrusive moments. The smell of burning oil triggering a memory of smoke and fire. The sound of a car backfiring making him flinch in a way he hadn't in years. He had thought he had left the war behind, had buried it beneath the weight of everyday life. But now it was rising to the surface, and Frank didn't know how to push it back down. Emma noticed the change in him, the way he stared off into the distance during meals, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. She asked him once if he was okay, and he lied, telling her he was just tired, just busy, just getting old. She didn't believe him, but she didn't press, and Frank was grateful for that. One evening, as the sun set and the shop fell into shadow, Frank found himself alone, the employees gone for the day, the silence pressing in around him. He sat on a stool in the corner, his hands black with grease, and stared at the phone Thompson had called from, the senator's business card still tucked into his wallet, where Frank had put it without thinking. He hadn't called Thompson, hadn't reached out, and he told himself he never would. But the card was there, a tangible reminder of the connection between them, and Frank couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He thought about Thompson's words at the diner, about how the senator had spent his entire career trying to live up to the life Frank had saved. And Frank felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow. Thompson had turned Frank's act of duty into a burden, a debt that could never be repaid. And in doing so, he had robbed it of its simplicity. Frank hadn't saved Thompson to create a legacy or inspire gratitude. He had done it because it was the only choice he could live with. But now, 20 years later, that choice felt heavier than it ever had, weighted down by Thompson's guilt and gratitude. Frank stood, wiping his hands on a rag, and walked to the small office at the back of the shop. The walls were covered with old calendars and faded photographs, reminders of the years that had passed, the work that had sustained him. He pulled open a drawer and found what he was looking for. A small, worn photograph of himself in uniform taken shortly before his discharge. He was younger in the photo, his face unlined, his eyes clear and certain, and Frank barely recognized the man staring back at him. That man had known who he was, had believed in the value of duty and sacrifice, had thought that saving lives was enough. But the man Frank was now, older, grayer, worn down by years of solitude and struggle, wasn't sure of anything anymore. He set the photograph on the desk, staring at it, and felt a wave of grief so sudden and overwhelming it made his chest ache. He grieved for the man he had been, for the certainty he had lost, for the life he had imagined but never lived. And he grieved too for Thompson, for the lieutenant who had survived but had never truly escaped the fire. The phone rang, pulling Frank from his thoughts, and he answered without thinking. his voice rough and tired. "Frank, it's me." Thompson's voice came through, hesitant and uncertain. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair, the photograph still in his hand. "What do you want, Senator?" he asked, his tone more weary than harsh. Thompson paused, and Frank could hear the sound of his breathing, steady and deliberate. "I've been thinking about what you said," Thompson began. "About how I'll never be free of this if I keep trying to repay you. And you're right. But I don't know how to let it go, Frank. I don't know how to live with the fact that I owe you everything and can give you nothing." Frank closed his eyes, the weight of Thompson's words settling over him like a blanket. "You don't owe me anything," Frank said again, but the words felt empty now, inadequate. "You keep saying that," Thompson replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "But it doesn't change how I feel. It doesn't change the fact that you gave me a second chance, and I've spent every day trying to deserve it." Frank didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. He thought about what Thompson had said, about the burden of gratitude, and realized that in some strange way they were both trapped by that night 20 years ago. Thompson was trapped by his guilt, by the need to repay a debt he could never settle, and Frank was trapped by his inability to accept anything from Thompson, by his own stubborn insistence that he didn't need help, didn't need recognition, didn't need anything at all. It was a deadlock, a stalemate, and Frank didn't know how to break it. "What do you want from me, Senator?" Frank asked finally, his voice quiet and raw. "What do you need to hear?" Thompson's breath hitched, and when he spoke his voice was thick with emotion. "I need to know that you don't regret saving me," he said. "I need to know that my life has been worth the risk you took." Frank felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The question was impossible, unbearable, because the truth was that Frank didn't know the answer. He didn't regret saving Thompson. He couldn't, wouldn't. But he also couldn't say with certainty that Thompson's life had been worth the cost of his own. Frank had given up so much in the years since the war. His marriage, his health, the dreams he had once carried. And while he didn't blame Thompson for those losses, he couldn't help but wonder if the balance was fair, if the life he had saved had justified the life he had lived. "I don't regret it," Frank said finally, the words coming slowly, carefully. "But you need to stop asking me to validate your life, Senator. That's not my job. You're the only one who can decide if you've been worth saving." Thompson was silent for a long moment, and Frank could hear the weight of the words settling over him. "I'm sorry," Thompson said quietly. "I'm sorry for putting this on you." Frank nodded, though Thompson couldn't see him. "Just live your life," Frank said. "That's all I ask. Stop carrying me around like a ghost." Thompson's voice cracked when he spoke again. "I'll try," he said, and the line went dead. Frank sat in the darkness of his office, the photograph still clutched in his hand, and felt something inside him release, just slightly, like a breath he had been holding for 20 years. Emma found the photograph on Frank's desk 3 days later, when she came to the shop to bring him lunch. She stood in the doorway of the office, holding the brown paper bag in one hand and the photograph in the other, her expression unreadable. Frank looked up from the engine he was working on, grease smeared across his forearm, and saw her standing there. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended, and Emma flinched slightly, setting the bag down on the desk. "It was just sitting here," she said, holding the photograph out to him. "Who is this?" Frank wiped his hands on a rag and took the photograph from her, staring at the young man in uniform, the stranger who had once been him. "That's me," he said quietly. "A long time ago." Emma's eyes widened, and she leaned closer, studying the image. "You were in the military?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. Frank nodded, tucking the photograph into his pocket, as if hiding it could erase the questions forming in her mind. "I was," he said, "for a while." Emma sat down in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, and Frank could see the curiosity burning in her eyes, the hunger for answers she had never asked for before. "You never told me," she said, her voice soft, almost hurt. "Why didn't you tell me?" Frank sighed, leaning back against the workbench, his arms crossed over his chest. "Because it wasn't important," he said, though the words felt like a lie even as he spoke them. "It was a long time ago, Em. It doesn't matter anymore." Emma shook her head, her expression hardening. "It matters to me," she said. "You're my dad. I want to know who you were before I was born." Frank looked at her, at the determination in her face, and felt a surge of guilt. He had spent so many years protecting her from the war, from the parts of himself that were broken and scarred, that he had forgotten she might want to know him, might need to understand the man who had raised her. "What do you want to know?" he asked finally, his voice resigned. Emma leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "Did you fight?" she asked. Did you hurt people?" Frank felt the question like a blow, sharp and unexpected, and he turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did what I had to do." Emma was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, gentler. "Did you save people too?" Frank nodded, his throat tight. "I tried," he said. "Not everyone, but I tried." Emma stood, crossing the small space between them, and placed a hand on his arm. "Tell me," she said. "Please, I want to understand." Frank looked at her, at the girl who had been the center of his world for 18 years, and realized that she wasn't a girl anymore. She was a young woman, capable of hearing the truth, of bearing the weight of it. And maybe, just maybe, she deserved to know. Frank told her about the war, not everything, but enough. He told her about the desert that looked like the one outside their window, about the endless days of heat and dust and fear. He told her about the men he had served with, the ones who had made it home and the ones who hadn't. And he told her about the night he had pulled a young lieutenant from a burning vehicle, about the way the flames had roared and the smoke had choked him, about the weight of the man's body as he dragged him to safety. Emma listened without interrupting, her eyes wide and glistening, and when Frank finished, she was silent for a long time. "That's why the senator called, isn't it?" she asked finally. "He was the lieutenant." Frank nodded, and Emma exhaled slowly, her hand tightening on his arm. "You saved his life," she said, her voice filled with awe. "And you never told anyone." Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the admiration in her voice. "It wasn't something to brag about," he said. "I just did what I had to do." Emma shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now, and Frank felt his own eyes burning. "You're a hero, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "You're a hero and you've been living like it didn't matter." Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and felt the weight of her words settle over him. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had survived, who had done his duty and come home and tried to build a life from the wreckage. But Emma's belief in him, her love and pride, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Seen. For the first time in years, Frank felt like someone understood him, like the things he had done and the sacrifices he had made were not invisible, not meaningless. "I love you, Em," he said quietly, his voice muffled against her hair. "I love you too, Dad," she replied. And they stood there in the dim light of the office, holding each other, two people bound by love and loss and the quiet strength of endurance. That night, after Emma had gone home, Frank sat alone in the shop, the photograph of his younger self still in his pocket. He thought about Thompson, about the senator's desperate need for validation, and he thought about Emma, about the way she had looked at him with pride and love. And he realized that maybe the problem wasn't that Thompson needed Frank's approval, but that Frank had spent so many years refusing to see himself as worthy of it. He had saved Thompson's life, yes, but he had also saved Emma's in a different way, by raising her alone, by giving her a home and a future. And maybe that was enough. Maybe being seen, being remembered, being loved was enough. Frank pulled out his phone and stared at Thompson's number, his thumb hovering over the screen. And then, slowly, he began to type. The message Frank sent to Thompson was simple, just a few words. "Let's talk. Tomorrow. Same place." He sent it before he could change his mind, and then he set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, wondering if he had made a mistake. But when Thompson replied almost immediately, his message filled with gratitude and relief, Frank knew he had done the right thing. They met again at the diner. The same corner booth, the same cracked vinyl and bitter coffee. This time, though, the atmosphere was different. The tension that had filled their previous meeting was still there, but it was softer now, more manageable, as if both men had come to some unspoken understanding. Thompson arrived first this time, and when Frank walked in, the senator stood, his face open and hopeful. "Thank you for reaching out," Thompson said, his voice warm. "I wasn't sure you would." Frank slid into the booth, ordering coffee without looking at the menu, and Thompson sat back down, his hands clasped on the table. "I've been thinking," Frank began, his voice steady, "about what you said, about needing to repay me, and I realized something." Thompson leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Frank's face, and Frank could see the hope and fear warring in his expression. "You can't repay me," Frank continued, "not in the way you're thinking, but that doesn't mean you can't do something." Thompson's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" he asked. Frank took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts, and then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You said you've spent your career fighting for veterans," Frank said. "That's good, that matters. But I think maybe you've been doing it for the wrong reasons. You've been doing it because you feel guilty, because you think you owe me. And that's not sustainable. Eventually, that guilt will burn you out, and then what will you have left?" Thompson's face paled, and Frank could see the truth of his words sinking in. "So what should I do?" Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank met his eyes, and for the first time he felt something like compassion for the senator. "Stop doing it for me," Frank said. "Do it because it's the right thing to do. Do it because those people deserve it, not because you think it will settle a debt." Thompson stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, and then slowly he nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been carrying you around like a weight, and I've been so focused on repaying you that I've lost sight of why I started doing this work in the first place." Frank nodded, relieved that Thompson understood. "You don't owe me anything," Frank said again. But this time, the words felt different, less defensive, more like a gift. "But if you want to honor what I did, then live your life in a way that makes it worthwhile. Help people because they need help, not because you need redemption." Thompson's eyes filled with tears, and he reached across the table, his scarred hand trembling slightly. Frank hesitated for a moment, and then he took it, their hands clasping in a gesture that felt like closure, like the end of something long and painful. "Thank you," Thompson said, his voice breaking, "for saving me. And for this." Frank nodded, squeezing Thompson's hand once before letting go. "You're welcome," he said simply. They talked for a while longer, the conversation easier now, less weighted. Thompson told Frank about his work in the Senate, about the bills he was fighting for, the veterans he was trying to help, and Frank told Thompson about Emma, about her college applications, her dreams of leaving the desert and seeing the world. Thompson listened with genuine interest, and when Frank mentioned that Emma was worried about affording school, Thompson's face lit up. "Let me help," Thompson said, his voice eager. "Not as a favor to you, but as something I want to do. There are scholarships, programs, things I can connect her to. Let me do that." Frank hesitated, his instinct to refuse rising automatically, but then he thought about Emma, about the way she had looked at him when he told her about the war. She deserved every opportunity, every chance to build a life beyond the desert. And if Thompson could help her, without it being a transaction, without it being about repaying Frank, then maybe it was okay. "All right," Frank said slowly, "but only if it's something she earns. No special treatment, just information, connections, things she can use." Thompson nodded eagerly, his face brighter than Frank had ever seen it. "I promise," he said. "I'll make sure she has every resource she needs." As they stood to leave, Thompson paused, his hand on the back of the booth, and looked at Frank with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something?" Thompson said, his voice hesitant. Frank nodded and Thompson continued. "Do you ever regret coming home? Do you ever wish you'd stayed in the military, built a career like I did?" Frank considered the question, surprised by the rawness of it, and then he shook his head. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. The war took enough from me. I wasn't going to let it take the rest of my life, too." Thompson nodded slowly, as if absorbing the words, and then he extended his hand again. "Thank you, Frank," he said, "for everything." Frank shook his hand, and this time the gesture felt final, like the closing of a chapter. "Take care of yourself, Senator," Frank said. And then he walked out into the sunlight, feeling lighter than he had in years. On the drive home, Frank thought about the conversation, about the way Thompson's face had changed when Frank told him to stop carrying guilt and start living with purpose. It had been a simple shift, but Frank could see how profound it was, how much it had freed Thompson from the weight he had been carrying. And in freeing Thompson, Frank realized, he had also freed himself. He had spent so many years resisting Thompson's gratitude, refusing to accept anything from him, that he had trapped himself in his own stubbornness. But now, by allowing Thompson to help Emma, by reframing the debt as an act of kindness rather than repayment, Frank had given them both a way forward. It wasn't about owing or being owed anymore. It was about two men who had survived a terrible night and were now trying in their own ways to make something good from it. And maybe, Frank thought, that was enough. 3 months later, Emma received her acceptance letter from a university in California, along with a scholarship that covered most of her tuition. She burst into the shop, waving the letter in the air, her face glowing with joy, and Frank felt his heart swell with pride. "I got in, Dad!" she shouted, throwing her arms around him. "I got in!" Frank held her tightly, his eyes burning with tears he didn't try to hide. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice rough. "You did this, Em. You earned it." Emma pulled back, looking at him with shining eyes. "Senator Thompson helped," she said. "He told me about the scholarship program. I wouldn't have known about it without him." Frank nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "He's a good man," Frank said. "I'm glad he could help." Emma studied his face, her expression thoughtful. "You saved his life, didn't you?" she asked. "And now he's helping save mine." Frank smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think we're all just helping each other," he said. "That's how it's supposed to work." The day Emma left for college was one of the hardest of Frank's life. He drove her to the airport, her suitcases loaded in the back of his truck, and the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. At the terminal, Emma turned to him, her eyes red and glistening. "I'm going to miss you so much," she said, her voice breaking. Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. "I'm going to miss you too," he said. "But I'm so proud of you. You're going to do amazing things. Emma nodded against his chest, and when she pulled back, she wiped at her eyes, trying to smile. "You'll call me, right?" she asked. "Every week?" Frank laughed, the sound watery. "Every week," he promised. He watched her walk through the terminal, her figure growing smaller and smaller, and when she finally disappeared from view, Frank stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of her absence settle over him like a physical thing. Driving home, Frank felt the loneliness creeping in, the quiet emptiness of a house that would no longer have Emma's laughter, her music, her presence. But he also felt something else, a sense of peace, of completion. He had raised her, had given her everything he could, and now she was ready to build her own life. That was what mattered. That was what all of this had been for. When he pulled into the driveway, he sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the house, and then he pulled out his phone. There was a message from Thompson sent earlier that morning. "Emma's going to do great things. You should be proud. And thank you, Frank, for letting me be a part of this." Frank smiled, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and then he typed a reply, "Thank you, Senator, for everything." He sent the message and set the phone down, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The debt was settled, not because it had been repaid, but because they had both chosen to let it go. The months that followed were quiet, but not empty. Frank continued to run the shop, fixing engines and helping the people of his town. He spoke with Emma every week, listening to her stories about classes and friends and the new life she was building. And occasionally, he heard from Thompson, who sent updates about legislation he was working on, victories for veterans that felt meaningful and real. Frank followed the news more closely now, watching Thompson's career with a kind of quiet pride. And he realized that in some strange way they were still connected, still bound by that night 20 years ago. But the connection no longer felt like a burden. It felt like something shared, something that had shaped them both in ways they were only now beginning to understand. One evening, as Frank sat on the porch of his house, watching the sun set over the desert, he thought about the choices he had made, the life he had lived. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been glamorous, but it had been his, and it had mattered. Frank thought about the man he had been in that photograph, the young sergeant in uniform who had believed in duty and sacrifice. That man was gone, eroded by time and loss and the quiet weight of survival. But in his place was someone else, someone who had learned that heroism wasn't about glory or recognition, but about showing up day after day and doing what needed to be done. Frank had saved Thompson's life, yes, but he had also saved his own, in the only way he knew how. By building something from the wreckage, by raising a daughter who would go on to change the world in her own way, by refusing to let the war define him. And maybe that was the real victory, not the act of pulling someone from the flames, but the decision to keep living, to keep fighting, long after the fire had gone out. Frank stood, stretching his tired muscles, and walked back into the house. The desert was dark now, the stars beginning to appear in the vast sky, and Frank felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had done his job. He had been a father, a soldier, a mechanic, a man, and that was enough. Years later, when Senator Thompson gave a speech at a veterans memorial, he spoke about a man who had saved his life, a man who had taught him the true meaning of service. He didn't use Frank's name, respecting the mechanic's desire for privacy, but he spoke of him with reverence and gratitude, and the words echoed across the nation. Frank watched the speech on television, alone in his living room, and he felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, sorrow, relief. Thompson had finally let go of the guilt, had finally understood that the debt wasn't something to be repaid, but something to be honored through the way he lived his life. And in that moment, Frank realized that he had let go too. He was no longer the man who had saved a lieutenant in a burning desert. He was simply Frank Romano, A mechanic, a father, a survivor, and that was enough. It had always been enough.